Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to continue by moving through the Great Depression and electing a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's going to complete the realignment of the party systems into the fifth party system and really set a bellwether as far as Democratic presidents and the modern view of the Democratic Party about the role of government in the economy. So let's dive in and talk about FDR. Here are your objectives for today. We're going to lay out the first New Deal today in order to break this down a little bit. And then next time, we'll get into the second New Deal and Roosevelt's legacy. So, in the election of 1832, Herbert Hoover was in pretty substantial trouble. Despite the fact that he had acted vigorously and much more aggressively than any president prior to trying to address the problems of the Great Depression, the combination of the depth of the Great Depression and also Hoover's previous messaging really led a lot of people to blame Herbert Hoover, most likely wrongly, for the problems of the country at this point. We also talked about the horrible optics of the bonus army and a lot of Herbert Hoover's prior statements about rugged individualism and how this didn't play well with struggling Americans who wanted a stronger, more vigorous, more complete response to the Great Depression. The Democrats offered this with Theodore Roosevelt and his quote unquote New Deal. For critics of this, the New Deal was a combination of sort of socialism and progressivism and potentially even communism, with government spending getting out of control in order to address or try to address a lot of the problems that were laid out in the whole Great Depression thing. For proponents of the New Deal, this was an attempt to actually use the vast powers of government that had been sort of created throughout the Progressive Era and World War I to really address society's domestic problems in a way that was utterly necessary because of the scope of the Great Depression. And most Americans at this time voted for FDR and his New Deal. Herbert Hoover does win his home state of Pennsylvania and some Republican strongholds in the North. But I mean, the contrast between 1928 and 1932 is pretty stark as far as voters' vision for the country and the pendulum of public opinion swinging in the other direction. And so FDR now has a broad mandate to go and try stuff. So here's what FDR is laying out. Here's his basic program. Take a moment, pause, and read, and then we'll move forward. FDR's New Deal was laid out in his first quote-unquote 100 days. This is the first 100 days of FDR's presidency where he's going to push most of his New Deal legislation through Congress with proposing vigorous solutions to society's problems. He's also going to begin using radio and mass media to try to get his message out, sort of copying his relative Theodore. And in fact, in a lot of ways, FDR is going to mirror Theodore in his methods, the way he presents himself, in his transformation of the presidency, things like that. FDR's 100 days are relevant to us as students of history and as modern Americans because this is often now described, the first 100 days are described as the time period in which a president can enact their most vigorous reforms, when they've got the most momentum, when they've got the strongest mandate, and when they can usually manipulate Congress into doing what they want. And so the 100 days have become a bellwether of presidents since Roosevelt to sort of evaluate them being able to implement their vision for the country that they laid out in the campaign. Here's FDR, one of his first fireside chats, again, using mass media to get directly in to the audience's homes and to Americans' homes. So here's him laying out his banking proposals. So pause, read, and we'll move forward. The bank holiday was one of the most important pieces of FDR's early legislation. He closed all banks before he could, in order to pass reforms to sort of stop the banking contagion. And this really helped restore faith in the banking system, especially after we passed FDIC to ensure bank deposits, which we'll get to momentarily. We're also going to repeal prohibition in order to both make alcohol illegal again, cut down on some of the organized crime, plus provide more tax revenue. Of course, because it was an amendment to the Constitution, we're going to now need a 21st Amendment that says just kidding about that 18th Amendment. But at this point, most people are on board with that, and so that gets ushered through without too much trouble. FDR's whole array of reforms are often called alphabet soup because a lot of these programs are known by their acronyms. We'll go through some of them in depth, but you really don't need to know a lot of the acronyms as long as you can pull in specific acronyms that fall into each of the three categories or the three R's of the New Deal: relief, recovery, and reform, which we'll go into each in their own turn. Here's him laying out Frances Perkins, or here's Frances Perkins describing some of her policies that she's pushing. So pause, read, move on. Relief is direct relief to Americans. And so this is through organizations like the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, things like that. The government is going to provide direct aid to states in order to hand out money to people potentially, and is also going to hire lots of people, with the idea being that if they give people jobs, they're putting money in people's pockets. That money can be spent further bolstering the economy and sort of jump-starting, priming the pump, and getting us to start moving out of this Great Depression. Here's the effect of the Civilian Conservation Corps. So take a moment, pause, read, and then we'll move on. Relief created a couple different things. One, although it did not create enough economic growth to boost us out of the Great Depression, it did restore faith of some people in the system. It probably prevented a larger social revolution by taking a lot of sort of aimless young men and directing them towards projects. We're going to build bridges, build dams, carve presidents' faces into mountains, a lot of fun stuff like that. And so, although it did not in the end the Great Depression, it did set us on a different course than we'd been on during the years of the Hoover administration. Recovery is attempting to reform the system in order to get us back on track. And so that's going to be things like the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which is going to attempt to raise farm prices by providing some relief for farmers and paying farmers not to plant crops in order to raise farm prices, and also buying up huge amounts of agricultural supplies and animals and destroying them in order to get them off the market. This highlights one of the main problems with these attempts to push broad economic relief is that farmers need higher prices in order to make sure that they can pay their bills, but workers need low food prices in order to make sure they can pay their bills. And so the AAA was extraordinarily unpopular, especially their destroying of healthy animals, because it's going to raise farm prices, and you've got hungry people in the cities who would desperately like that beef, but if you send it to them, it's going to further depress farm prices and hurt farmers. And so this is a real problem as far as the issues of rural and urban people being somewhat counterproductive or counter to each other, and it's really difficult to provide relief for both. Here he's laying out the AAA, so pause, read, move on. Probably the biggest and most sweeping one of the New Deal programs was the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA. The NRA regulated the industries, regulated wages, regulated prices. Its symbol was the blue eagle here. And it was more or less a government takeover of industry in an attempt to force industry to employ people and to raise wages in order to get the economy going again. The problem, of course, is what authority does Congress have to seize control of businesses and dictate how business owners run it? That's not so clear. And so, like a lot of these New Deal programs, FDR is merely trying things without really understanding how it would be interpreted or whether or not it's even constitutional or legal. It's just the government passing broad laws and then trying to sort out the details of it later. We also get FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is incredibly important because it insures bank deposits. And it really has made 1928 through 1932. That was the last major banking panic in American history, because now bank deposits are insured. And so you can be assured that if your bank goes out of business, you will still get your money back. The federal government is ensuring that. And we're also going to create, through the Indian Reorganization Act, we're going to recreate reservations for Native Americans. We'll talk more about that later. Just noteworthy, it is part of the New Deal. Also, we get the TVA, which is going to do a number of different things. One, it's going to pay people to build hydroelectric dams. This is hopefully going to control flooding in the Tennessee River Valley. This is the Tennessee Valley Authority, by the way. So it's going to help control flooding, provide jobs for people, and also provide access to electricity in a lot of rural areas that wouldn't have had it. And so, from all of these things, the TVA is going to serve multiple goals, multiple R's here, which is one of the reasons why a lot of these New Deal programs are very difficult to categorize in specific areas. FDR was extraordinarily, obviously, all of this stuff is super expensive, and FDR was super wary about running a balanced budget. Despite the fact that his critics and modern historians and students often paint him as a Keynesian who advocated running massive budget deficits in order to get us out of economic turmoil, that really doesn't describe FDR at all. And he's going to significantly hike taxes during his term to try to pay for this, and also do things like cut pensions and try to cut government spending in other places to pay for his New Deal programs. And so the irony of it is at the same time that FDR is pushing expansionary fiscal policy, he's also pushing contractionary fiscal policy. And a lot of these actions by FDR are going to slow the economy in about approximate amounts to the things that he's going to grow the economy. And so it's really going to be a kind of a zero-sum game here, with FDR using policies to grow the economy and paying for them with policies that will shrink the economy. So that's going to be really problematic for FDR going forward. FDR, as extreme as he was not the cutting edge of extremism. We're going to see significantly more extremism from people going forward. For example, there was an attempt by business leaders to overthrow FDR, this thing known as the business plot. There was this fear that all of this standardization was tyrannical, and so we needed to overthrow FDR. And the hope was they were going to put a guy named Smedley Butler in charge. But Smedley Butler was not interested in this. There was no real backing beyond a few business leaders for this attempted overthrow of the government. And so the fascist overthrow of the government does not happen in the United States. We do get other people who are very extreme. For example, a guy named Francis Townsend is going to propose this idea of pensions for old people, which is going to be very popular amongst old people, and of course will eventually be folded into FDR's second New Deal. Charles Coughlin was a Catholic priest who originally supported FDR, but then eventually got far more radical than him and started trading on a bunch of really racist tropes and had a huge audience through his radio broadcasts. So you should know Francis Townsend, who is radical but not that radical. Charles Coughlin, who's going to get, pretty fascist as we move forward. And then really the kingfish Huey Long. He's going to take these sort of principles and take them to their logical extreme. So take a moment and pause and read the Share Our Wealth plan. Obviously, as extreme as FDR is, Huey Long is far more extreme, proposing national wealth caps, universal basic incomes, income caps, all these other things. He was planning on challenging FDR for president, or at least for the Democratic nomination in 1936, when he was assassinated. We think that he was assassinated based on, politics in his home state of Louisiana. He was a senator from Louisiana at the time. And so we think it was about patronage and issues in Louisiana. But of course, there's still conspiracy theories about how FDR was, eliminating his political rivals that I'm not going to get into at all. But Huey Long's Share Our Wealth Society dies with him, and further extremists do not gain much traction in the United States. In fact, the general consensus amongst historians is that FDR may have given us a little socialism to save us from a lot of socialism, because without programs like this, there's no telling how much support people like Huey Long and his ilk would have gotten. So as far as results for this, FDR is going to some degree restore confidence of the American people. Whether or not you agree with his basic governing philosophy, the fact that most Americans could hear his voice on a regular basis and had a sense that he was doing things in order to solve these economic problems really helped restore faith of a lot of Americans in the system. It also made the president a much more central and personable figure than we've ever seen before. And so his role in sort of steadying the nation's confidence was incredibly important. But farmers were still really struggling during this time period, and the AAA really did nothing to stop farm foreclosures. And unemployment was still incredibly high. There was still significant problems with homelessness and with the unemployment rate hovering between 20 and 30%. GDP was still down, the stock market was still down, and the Great Depression really had not been solved by this first New Deal. So, although FDR did a lot to reestablish the nation's confidence as far as actually solving the nation's financial crisis, solutions are still at this point elusive. Plus, the Dust Bowl, still dust bowling, turns out government legislation can't stop dust storms. And so we're still having dust storms. We're still having the exodus of Okies out to the West Coast. And for a lot of people, the hard times are going to continue throughout FDR's first term. So, as FDR is staring down a potential re-election campaign in 1936, next time we'll start talking about his second New Deal and some of the programs that he laid out to try to solve the problems that his previous programs had not yet solved. So we'll leave us there for now. Thank you for listening.